All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Awesome. So, here you go. Next week is different. I know that teacher columns are basically the same thing every time, but Clint will be teaching class next week, and so that's new. I will be out of town. I'll be going down to the Florida College lectures, and so Clint will be covering for me. There is 4 events and 4 people, like I say pretty much every week. This is a good way to remember Genesis. 4 events, 4 people. We're not going to spend too much time today. This is the outline of today's class. So we're going to spend, if I had to guess how this is going to be divided up, we're probably going to spend more time in Genesis 22 than anything else. At least I hope so. And then spend some time in 20 and 21. And I'm going to be honest, we're probably not going to say pretty much anything about chapter 23. Sarah dies, that's what happens. There's probably more to say, but just for the sake of class, 4 chapters, not going to spend too much time. So we get into this first part of God protecting the innocent. We've seen God protecting people in the past. We've seen this throughout the book of Genesis, and that's been a great thing. Remember Hagar, and she was in the wilderness, and God protected her. She was the outcast. She was kind of forsaken. She ran away. She was being mistreated, and God saw her and came to her and provided for her. And so God again is doing a similar thing and looking out for people, and not just Abraham and his lineage, but we'll see in this story, he's looking out for a pagan king. So Abraham, he messes up. So if you remember back in chapter 12, there was a situation with Egypt. So he gets called, he goes from his homeland. When he goes from his homeland, it's like, hoorah, yes, Abraham, you did the right thing to do. And then immediately following that, there's a famine. And when the famine hits, he goes all the way to Egypt. That was like not the move, not a good thing to do. And when he gets there to Egypt, he lies kind of about his wife, Sarah, and says, this is my sister, which we'll see here is kind of like a half-truth. So we catch that later in verse 12. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So they're half-siblings. They're half-siblings that got married, is what the text says. And so they're half-siblings, they're married, and so what Abraham is doing here is he's kind of telling a half-truth. And this is of the serpent. This is how the serpent acted in the garden. He told a half-truth. And so it's not good when God's people are being similar in characteristics to the serpent in the garden. Just not a good thing that's happening. And so one of the things that's happening, and we'll get to a conclusion of this at the beginning, but this is one of Abraham's faults. He's not trusting for God to provide for him, not trusting in the provision of God for his people. And we've seen Abraham kind of have an iffy relationship with this. Sometimes he's doing really good. Sometimes he's trusting in God. And other times he's just not. He's not trusting in God like he needs to. And this is an example of that. I want you to notice verse 11. Abraham said, and this is after this whole situation goes down, and Abimelech confronts Abraham for tricking him and for lying. And this is what it says in verse 11. Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And what we see here is that Abraham is projecting his own sin onto Abimelech. The truth is that Abimelech has more fear of God in him than Abraham does, at least in this story. Abraham is not trusting in the power of God to get him through the situation, but Abimelech does fear God and does repent and does have this conversation of reverence and respect to the character and authority of who the Lord is. And so that's something that I think needs to be highlighted, is that Abraham kind of is projecting here at the end what's going on in his own heart. I put this question in almost, there we go. I put the question in the wrong place, so we'll come back to it. So we are here. So this is the situation of what is going on. God stops Abimelech before he commits the sin. So Sarah and Abraham come in and they say, hey, we're actually siblings. And so Abimelech, even though she's 90, I guess she's a very attractive 90-year-old, very attractive 90-year-old. And she says, I want to take you for my wife. And so he goes and takes Sarah to be his wife. And then God kind of intervenes in the situation. And so notice verse 4, now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? And so God comes and says, basically, you've done something that's like really bad. You've taken another man's wife. I'm not okay with that. And if you don't go back on this, I'm going to kill you. And we get here, and it says and it affirms that nothing did happen. I don't know. I really don't. Chapter 12, we don't get the same language here. We don't get the same whatever is going on. Chapter 12 seems a little more iffy on the language. The Pharaoh in that case says he takes her as his wife. I don't know exactly what that means. But Abimelech here has a different type of character. It seems that the Pharaoh back in that day was kind of like, get this away from me. I want nothing to do with this. And Abimelech is doing that as well. But there's something kind of deeper going on here, where it's not just I kind of want this away from me, but it's I want to be doing the right thing. Notice how he says things later on, like verse 9. So verse 9 says, Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, What have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? So it's not just that he's trying to get the practical things out of his life. We'll see that there's some kind of sickness associated with this. But it also seems to be he cares about the moral integrity of the situation. Which this is impressive because he's the king of the Philistines. It's not like he's the king of Israel. It's not like, this is the guy we thought would do the thing that you're supposed to do. This is a guy who is the king of a pagan nation, and he's worried about the sin involved. And he's worried about the mistakes being made. And so what we see about the character of God is really interesting in this situation and in this story. It's not like God is like, I'm going to just kind of stand back and let whatever is going on, even though he's not aware of it, happen. God gets in the way of sin being committed by the innocent party. And therefore, not only is he protecting Sarah, which we saw back in chapter 12, he's also protecting Abimelech. This also is very important to say. The Bible doesn't teach that when Genesis 12 happens, God just kind of forgot about the rest of the nations and really didn't care about them at all. And then, Christianity happened and he started caring about the other people again. That's not what happens throughout the biblical story. We get an instance like this where it seems to be that he cares about Abimelech's interests, but you also have bigger stories like Jonah, where he sends a prophet to a pagan nation so that they would repent. And there's many more. But it's not like the Gentiles just were forgotten about for thousands of years and then all of a sudden he started caring. He cares about all people, and he cares about the innocent parties, and he cares about the people trying to do the right things. And I think we get a glimpse of that in this story with Abimelech. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Miss Angela?
I just remember of Ananias and Sapphira, where they conspired to tell the same story even though it wasn't true. And so our influence on other people is important. We should be trying to do the right thing to get them to do the right thing. But if we're not, the other person needs to stand up and say, hey, that's not right. We should not do that.
Yes, and I think you even get kind of some of that where Isaac commits the same sin. So he gets put in a very similar situation. And so Isaac, I think it's chapter 26. I think that's right. Might not be. I think it's chapter 26. Basically, is in the same situation with a similar king, and the influence of Abraham extends. And it's not like, well, Abraham did the wrong thing, and I need to do something different now, like it should have been in Ananias and Sapphira as well. Any other thoughts? Awesome. Oh, sorry, Spencer.
I do think it's important here where he says, I didn't touch her, because in the very next chapter it talks about the birth of Isaac. So it kind of clears up this isn't another reverse Hagar situation where maybe Isaac is not Abraham's actual son.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. I think that's actually really, really cool to point out of the aspect of you have here. This is not Abraham was unable to, and then now because of another means, now Sarah can produce. You even see that on the flip side of this. After Sarah dies, Abraham produces other children and did with Ishmael as well. But here, like you're saying, it's very much Abraham's the father. It's not Abimelech. That's for certain. I think that's super important to highlight. All right, I mentioned this, but so cool thing. Here, Abraham is specifically called a prophet. So if you notice verse 7, now then return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you and you shall live. So this is a role we see that Abraham's called. But at the same time, we see this like physical ailment going on. So remember, God says, if you don't return her, you're going to die, and you and all that are yours. That's verse 7. And then you have down in verse 17, then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And so I don't know what this look like, and I don't really know how you can quickly tell this. How can you quickly tell that women aren't able to produce children? No idea. Maybe there was some mark. Maybe they weren't even aware that that was one of the things happening. Maybe they just had ignorance to it, and it's God wiped away the consequence they weren't aware of. But whatever's going on, Abimelech, for some reason, and we're not really told details, has some sort of ailment that needs healing. And maybe that is part of what's going on. I do think, like I said earlier, he cares about the moral integrity of the situation. What is right, what is wrong. But it also seems to be that there's this physical ailment that he wants to get rid of, and gets rid of through doing the right things. And I think where this comes up, and what this brings up, is how much more are the consequences of our sin. Or maybe every time we sinned, if we broke out in leprosy, we'd be ooh, I really need to do something about that. But really the reality of the situation is worse than leprosy, but we don't treat it with the same immediacy. We don't treat it with the same seriousness, and we kind of just say it is what it is at some points. I think what needs to be going on in our brains when we are involved in sin is I want to get rid of this like it's a disease. It's a disease that can kill me, and that will have effects on my own life. And not only on my own life, but the people's lives around me. I think that should be on our minds here. And I think that's a cool example that we get from here. Any other thoughts before we keep going to the next story? Awesome. So we get chapter 21. Chapter 21, you have the birth of Isaac. And it starts off with this beautiful verse. And so we'll read it. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said. And the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And so imagine, Abraham gets the promise when he's 75. So it's been 25 years. And then you have Sarah, who's kind of been involved in this, and maybe she's had some hesitations throughout the time of, is it going to be by me? Is it not going to be by me? Maybe sometimes she's thinking yes. Chapter 16 says sometimes she's thinking no. And so maybe it's this in and out, this doubtfulness. We get to chapter 18. We get to chapter 18, and these three angels visit her, and she laughs at the idea. At this point in her life, where she's reached 89, and she has God tell her, you're going to have a child, this has just been a laughable matter to her. And then, right as this verse says, the Lord did as he said, and he did as he promised. And this shows the faithfulness of God. If God says you're going to get to the other side, you're going to get to the other side. If God says you're going to have a child at 90 years old, you're going to have a child at 90 years old. His word is firm, and his word is sure. And I think one of the things that's trying to be portrayed in this story is that at no point can you say, that was for sure from Abraham and Sarah. And I have no doubts about that, glory be to them. You have instances like this in Hebrews 11 where it says quite the opposite. By faith, Sarah had herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. So it's saying, Sarah, she doesn't have the power to conceive. She's past the age of bearing children. And Abraham, he's basically good as dead. And then God says, through those two people, I'm going to produce a child. That's the power of God in the story. That's the power of God that's being portrayed throughout this story. But then we kind of get this, I think, uncomfortable aspect of what's going on here. It's this great moment. Isaac is born. Everyone's cheering. you get him called Isaac, remembering that that's what he was supposed to be called in verse 3. Verse 4, he's circumcised. Verse 5, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. But she said, Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a child? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So this promise is so unlikely that after it is fulfilled, and after Isaac comes into the world, Sarah's basically like, I'm going to be the laughing stock. Like, I'm going to kind of be made fun of because now I have a child and I'm 90 years old, and that's like an impossible thing. And people will be coming to me and being like, who would have thought? Like, who would have thought Sarah? Am I right? And like, that's like the town talk. And you know, you're like, maybe that's not the type of laughter. Maybe it's like we're laughing with you and like it's like a good thing. And then immediately you're confirmed that's not the case. It's not the case of what she's worried about. And that's not the case of the attitudes involved in this. So look at verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned, that's Isaac. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Does anyone have any other translations? Scoffing. What else we got? Mocking. Colin, what do you have LSB, right? What does it say? Laughing in jest. I like that one. Okay, so this is not just like a laughing with you. This is a mocking laughter towards. Keep reading. So she said to Abraham, Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Okay, so they are determined to send away this child now, Ishmael and Hagar. And notice Abraham's reaction to this in verse 11. The thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. Okay, so kind of a hard thing to work through. Why does God command Abraham to send Ishmael and this slave woman, who no fault of her own, at least, is put in this situation? Like, why is that something God commands? And I think one of the things that we're seeing here is, I think, a point that's being made in Genesis, is that there's consequences to polygamy. And like some people, they'll be like, God's okay with polygamy because it's in the Bible. And you see and then you see stories like this where it's like, no. Like polygamy, almost every time it's involved, if not every time, has like serious issues and like causes like internal conflict almost always. Where you have this internal jealousy. You see it with Hagar and Sarah, and you see it with Leah and Rachel. And it's just like not good. It doesn't produce the purpose or the intent of marriage. And so you see that here. And notice how this is displeasing to Abraham. So Sarah basically is like, send them away. I want nothing to do with them. And Abraham's like, I don't want that. Like, this is my son. And I think that's a pretty reasonable response. And he's like, I'm not going to send them into the wilderness. But then God has to come to him and say, do as Sarah says. And I think the reasoning behind that, at least part of the reasoning behind that, is he has to trust that Isaac is the promised child. So notice that. Notice that at the end of verse 12. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And so as part of Abraham here, still kind of doubting that. That like maybe Isaac will be, but we kind of have Ishmael here, and so maybe it'll be Ishmael, and you're kind of going back and forth, and God says, no, you need to do this so that like you're certain, and that you're like confident in this decision. You send him away because it's Isaac who it's going to be through. This creates a dynamic where you get to like chapter 22, and he's, spoiler alert, he has to give up his son and like is asked to sacrifice him. And there's like no backup plan. Like if you kill Isaac, there's no backup plan. Ishmael's already gone. He's out in the wilderness. Elar?
You notice in life and here too, in God's word too, that when you have a relationship and a pregnancy that's outside of what God expects, meaning one man, one woman, and they're married and they have children, outside of that, that it puts a burden, a terrible burden on the woman and the child. And that's in true life. A man has an affair with a woman, she's pregnant. The woman typically has to raise the child and has the burden of the child, and the child has that burden. So this is just, you see it right here, that this is a truism, and it's not God's way. They went around God's way. And it shows you we need to stay with God's way of one man, one woman married, and that.
There are definitely consequences. I think the beauty of what's happening here is that the responsibility of the husband transfers from Abraham to God. So you have Hagar, who, the point of, not the sole point, so grace of the words, but is the husband supposed to take care of his wife and his children. And so that's the male responsibility throughout Scripture. And so there's a sense of responsibility, and so Abraham doesn't want to give up because I think he understands somewhat that responsibility, but God says, I'm going to provide for them, and I'm going to take care of them. But I think what you're saying is still valid and true, that when you get into situations like this or similar to it, there is definite consequences and hardships that are associated and integrated within these situations. And so that's part of this as well, that God kind of takes on the husband role of providing, and we see how this turns out. They go into the wilderness, and you have, you go into the wilderness, and you have the situation where, Hagar runs out of water, and she's carrying the child, and it seems like she puts under the child, puts the child under the bush, there you go, puts the child under the bush, and goes to God, and she cries out to God. So notice the end of verse 16. And she sat opposite of him, that being the child, and lifted up her voice and wept. In verse 17, and God heard the voice of the boy. Look at verse 18. Lift up the boy, hold him fast with your hand, and I will make him into a great nation. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God is faithful to his word, just like he was with his promise of Isaac. He's faithful to take care of Hagar and this boy. I think I'm going to skip that. But basically, what's going on here is you see this provision. God taking care. Abraham trusting. And you're like, great. That was a really hard test. You have a child, you love them, you want to take care of them, and then God's like, send them away. You're like, ooh, that's really hard. And then we get to chapter 22. So chapter 12, you see the situation where God asks Abraham to go. Go from your homeland. And this is a challenging command. Go from your homeland, give up these things. And you have to think, like, giving up your family, giving up your home, giving up your wealth, even though he was wealthy after, but imagine how much more if he stayed around his family and could build up the wealth even more. Give up your comfort, give up your stability. He's giving all those things up. And so at 75, Abraham gives up his entire past. And then in chapter 22, God comes to Abraham and says, I want you to give up your entire future. You were willing to give up your past. You were willing to make those hard decisions. Will you do the same the other way? Are you willing to give up these things that matter so much to you? And I talked about this in my sermon on Sunday, so it's not going to be the primary lens we talk about, but I do want to mention it. There's an idolatry lens going on here. So the first time that love is ever mentioned in the Bible, Genesis 22. Genesis 22, where it says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall tell you. And so the first time in the Bible that love is ever mentioned is here. And when it's mentioned, it said, you got to give up the thing in which you love. And this is a big test, because like I just said earlier, you see 6 times before this, the seed is promised. And so imagine, you have God coming to Abraham and saying, you're going to have a seed that's going to come from you, and there's going to be a blessing of nations. And he comes to you again. And sometimes you really doubt that in chapter 15. And God says, no, you're going to do it. And then he does this over and over again 6 times, and there's just emotion building. And then he comes here and says, you have this finally. Now, do you love me more than what you've waited for 25 years? How much would it be easy for Abraham to put his value in Isaac, his meaning? I gave up a lot to have this. All those things I just mentioned in chapter 12. I've sojourned, and I trusted in God's promises. Now I have this, and it's a blessing. It's a blessing from God, but I don't want to let go of it. See, the thing with sin is it's sometimes really easy to recognize. You're okay, sin, it's bad, and I can see these consequences in my life, and that's why I should get rid of it. Sometimes idols are harder because they're not as easy to identify because you don't want to be as honest with yourself about it. Because the thing is, an idol is a good thing, but it's when a good thing becomes a God thing, and then that good thing becomes a bad thing. So you can have a good thing in your life that's not inherently wrong within itself. You can have a relationship, you can have a career, you can have money. That's not wrong. A lot of those things are just blessings from God. But when you get your meaning and your value and find your purpose in that thing, that becomes a God thing. And when a good thing becomes a God thing, that becomes a bad thing. And so we see how idolatry is supposed to be handled. When we see idols in the temple of God, God's not go in there and just treat them really lightly and pick them up kindly and just move locations and maybe move it to another temple. He's no, go into that temple and cleanse it, and go in that temple and rip those things out, and go in that temple and just just wreak havoc on anything that's not supposed to be there, because that's not of me. And when we're supposed to be handling idolatry in our own lives, it's going to be uncomfortable at times. If you are that temple of God, and you're supposed to be cleansed of your idols, sometimes getting purged of your idols is going to be a painful process. But God says you need to do it. Because the question is, do you love me more than anything else? What is your priority list? If I'm not one, then your list is wrong. It's messed up. You see in Hebrews 11, this is talked about. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was said in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall be your offspring be named. He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So we're about to go through this story of what exactly happens with everything and how it's connected to Jesus. But I think this is important to understand because very similar, but even probably to a more difficult level, this is a passage I think we can easily struggle with. So you have Ishmael being sent away, and you're okay, struggling through that, but maybe I can get somewhere with it. And then you have a passage like this, where you're why would a good God want Abraham to offer up his son? And what's going on there? And we see going on in Abraham's mind, where you're probably also questioning that, why would Abraham be willing to do this if he's a righteous man? Is that Abraham thinks, and he's thinking through this, and he's gotten to a place in his faith where he's saying, I don't understand why God is asking me to do this, but what I do understand is that God is going to be faithful through this. And so I know that God told me I was going to have this offspring, and he told me there was going to be this lineage and this blessing that was through this thing, and so I can trust in that. And so the way that I've configured in my head how this is going to work is that I'm going to kill Isaac, but God is going to raise him from the dead. And so that's where Abraham's at when you get into this story. And we can talk a little bit more about maybe some of the hardship of this passage. But I think that's important to be in your mind. Seeing the New Testament passage, this, and reading that back into the Old Testament. It's not that Abraham's acting wildly. He has come to a point where he believes that God is going to be faithful and bring Isaac back. It also mentions that, figuratively speaking, he did come back from the dead. That in this story, he's pretty much as good as dead. That to Abraham, it's basically that he killed Isaac, but like Isaac was brought back. Like in his head, he had already committed the action. Like that's how willing he was to do this. And so this brings up a really cool point. So there's something in the Bible called typology, parallelism. When stories shadow, build off of each other, point to a future story, especially Jesus. And so like the story of the Bible, one story. This was the first instance of typology that I ever came across. I was like, I don't know, 13, 14. I went to one of those teen weekend things, and the dude there, really cool guy, I know him now. He was like, okay guys, open your Bibles to Genesis 22. And I want to show you how Jesus is in the Old Testament. And this is the passage he went through. I think it's one of the most extreme and maybe easier to see typologies in the Bible. There's many things that are paralleled in the New Testament, but this one's pretty obvious, I think. And so let's walk through this story together. God comes to Abraham and he says, "Go and offer up your only son with whom you love." And there's the parallel there of Jesus and how Jesus was the only begotten Son of God, whom he was willing to give up and sacrifice on the cross. But even more so than just that simple point, it goes on further. And so we already read, but he says, "Go to this land of Moriah." And in 2 Chronicles 3, we find out this is where the temple was built. This is the mountain range the temple was built on. And so in this mountain range that the temple was built on, you have Moriah, and that's where this takes place. But you also have, similarly on this mountain range, many people would think that Golgotha is a part of this. And so it's not just a singular mountain where it's that's the mountain of Moriah. It's this range. And so this is the same location or the range of mountains that Jesus would be crucified on. But it goes further than that. So he says go to this land. Abraham wakes up early in the morning. And I don't know how that night of sleep was. Imagine, you're thinking through these things. And you're like, I have to sacrifice my son tomorrow morning. Maybe that's a day I sleep in. Don't really want to get up out of bed. And then you have Abraham who's like, no, let's get up first thing in the morning. And Abraham gets up first thing in the morning and he goes and he takes this donkey and he takes his son Isaac. And he goes and is going to offer this sacrifice. And there's these conversations with his servants, and basically it comes to a point where he says, okay, you guys stay here now. Now it's just going to be me and Isaac. We're going to go ahead. And while they're walking along the way, Isaac is carrying his own wood. And so similarly to how Jesus would carry his own cross, Isaac's carrying his own wood. And when Isaac's carrying his own wood, he's looking around, and he's kind of like, okay, we got the wood, I got that. You got the knife, we got that. Where's the sacrifice? What's up with that? So you have this conversation that's had in verses 7 and verses 8. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father, and he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them, together. I believe how we're supposed to read this is that Isaac knows what's going on here. That he's not some ignorant little boy child that doesn't know what's going on, and then they get on top of this mountain, and then he's strapped down real tight. I think that's a misreading and misinterpretation of this passage. I think in this moment, what we're supposed to understand, what we're supposed to read, is that they're going up and they're doing this together. That there's a submission of will going on. And this is my argument for that. Come on, there we go. One more time. Isaac's not like a small child, and I think this is sometimes something that we get confused on because of the pictures maybe we grew up on. That's what I'm trying to say. And so we have these pictures in our head of Isaac being this little 8-year-old, and Abraham going up there and sacrificing this 8-year-old child. But that doesn't seem to be consistent with both classic interpretations with the Jews, but also just other things that are kind of cluing us in. So Isaac's strong enough to carry his own wood. And you could argue, these kids are doing a lot more than kids do nowadays. And these kids are probably stronger than they are nowadays. But whatever age he is, he's strong enough to carry his own wood on his back, up enough for a sacrifice. On top of that, you're like, verse 5 though, it says he's a boy. And like, a boy is a boy. But this is often talked about for like teenagers and young adults. So here are a couple examples. When Joseph is 17 years old, he is called this Hebrew word, a boy. When Benjamin is a grown man, he's called this Hebrew word, a boy. When Absalom is leading a rebellion against King David, he is called this Hebrew word. So it's not, I think it's too much to say, well, I'm going to go this whole basis off of the fact of this one word, and so that's why I think he's like this 7-year-old boy. I think Scripture as a whole doesn't show consistency with that idea. But then you also have this idea that many days have passed since then, so it doesn't seem to be near his birth. But finally you get like things like this. Josephus, who said that Isaac was around 25. Josephus can kind of be inaccurate sometimes, so take it or leave it. But you have rabbinic tradition. And rabbinic tradition, the rabbis of the Jews, says because of chapter 23, Sarah lived 127 years old. Okay, that means she had Isaac at 90. She dies at 27. If you're supposed to read this chronologically back to back, which might not be the case, I can say that. It could be that he's 37, because that's the amount of time. And so at 37 years old, that's what's going on. I don't care to be firm and hard on that like 37 or 25 number because those people said it. There's other rabbinic traditions that are just completely out of left field. But I do think because of the consistency of how the word is used throughout Scripture and the fact he was strong enough to carry his own wood, you have the situation going on where it seems to be he's old enough to understand those things. And let's just say, for like sake of argument, he's like 14. Okay, so like imagine like Jake. Okay, Jake's like 13, around that age. Is that right, Miss Amanda? Okay, awesome, thank you. So Jake's like 13, and yeah, Jake's like pretty big for a 13-year-old. But then imagine like someone older than Ethel, and then like you're like, okay, if Jake's in danger of his life and he's fighting someone older than Ethel, money's on Jake, and like that's where like my situation is going in here, and I think like that's also like very fair of what's going on here. That even if maybe ages don't work the exact same, there would still be a discrepancy of strength when Hebrews 11 describes him as good as dead, and you have this teenage boy. I think just like there's a fair, so there's a willingness. Anyway, that's my point. Of all that, I just think because of how much it's argued otherwise, I think there just had to be more evidence. But there's a willing sacrifice going on here. And so there's this expectation. He's submitting to the will of the Father, just like Jesus does. And so they get on top of this mountain, and you have Abraham, and he's about to give this sacrifice. Eric likes to point out, the knife probably wasn't up here like this, but it's probably at his throat because that's how you do burnt offerings. And so maybe he has the knife at his throat, and he's about to cut his throat open. And then he's like, God comes and says, Abraham, Abraham, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And so he passed the test. He was willing to, but God stops him before he does. God is not in line and is not for child sacrifice. There are so many warnings of not Jesus, God, Yahweh, sure. Yahweh saying, this is not okay, and this is abomination to me. And I'm not okay with child sacrifice, and that's not the point of the text and what's going on here. There's other points being made. But what's beautiful about this is that this potentially is not where this typology stops. Some extend it even further than this. And so you have the situation where, Dad, we have the wood, we have the fire, but like, where's the lamb? God's going to provide for it. And then you get to this part, and you see in verse 13, Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And he goes, and he went, and he took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son Isaac. So some would argue that this is when we take the role of Isaac. So until this point, you see Jesus taking the role of Isaac, but it switches here. It switches to where we are Isaac. We were the one that was supposed to get sacrificed, and God offers a substitute with his son Jesus. That instead of us dying, this Lamb of God, this ram, this male lamb, that is caught by its horns in this thicket of thorns, So many like alliterations. He goes and he dies, and he's the sacrifice. And so maybe there's something to that effect as well, where he's caught by his head in thorns, just like Jesus wore a crown of thorns. Notice like verse 14, and I think this is like super important. So if you caught all that, you didn't get to verse 14, this is important. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said, to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. It seems to be that the tense of what's going on there is not only present, but it seems to at least be including the future as well. And the problem with this is it's a beautiful, not a problem, the beautiful thing about this is it's a moment that's ending the story of Abraham. And we see Abraham for a few more chapters, and he's kind of more of a side character as we keep going through this. But you see this beautiful thing where Abraham's always struggled with this idea that God is going to provide for me. And like I can trust in the provision of the Lord. And you see that throughout his story, where sometimes it's like, yeah, he trusts in God and he leaves his home. And then it's like, no, he goes to Egypt for provision instead of God and doesn't trust in God. And then you're like, yeah, he sends Lot away and trusts that God is going to be faithful to his promise. And he risks his life to rescue Lot. And so maybe he could have even died there. And he like trusted in God. And he refuses spoil from Sodom. And you're like, yeah, let's go. He even like believes in the promises of God. And then you get to like Hagar. You're like, I thought he learned. I thought he learned. I thought he was good on this. And he like tries to like fast track God's plan. It's like not a good situation. And then you keep going. And it's like, oh, that's not good. He laughs at the fact that God said that this offspring is going to be through Sarah. He's not trusting in God there. But then, he trusts in God to like save the righteous. And he like has this conversation where he kind of like dwindles God down to like, 10 people. And if there's 10 righteous people there, then like save the city. And you're like, you're back at it. And then immediately he goes and deceives Abimelech for safety. And you're like, no, that's like not good. And then he sends away Ishmael, and you're like, yes. And then you get here. And my point with that is you see these failures of Abraham along the way. And you see the struggle that I think is just real. And I think maybe it's safe to say everyone's walk with their faith. Where like you want it to be that like all these are green. And like if you like took your life and you made it into these like chapter book. And you're like, every time that there's a test, like I always succeeded and I always trusted in God. And like Lord willing and like, by his grace, like sometimes they are green. And like sometimes we do the right things, but other times they're orange. Sometimes we really struggle with that. And what we're getting to in the Abraham narrative is this climactic and this end point where it says, okay, now here's like the big test of them all. What are you going to do? Where are you going to lay your cards? Where are you going to lay your eggs? Like, what is it going to be? And Abraham passes, and he comes to this point where he can say this confidently. The Lord will provide. On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And I saw that here today, and I know that to be true for my life. And so now I'm going to go forward, and this is how I'm going to think about my life. And I think sometimes these hardships and these tests can be difficult. But they can get us to places like this, where we can say this with our chest, the Lord will provide. And we can mean it. The testing of his faith shows that it's a real faith. If there was never any problems, there was never any trials, there was never any testing, well, how do you know it's real? If it's always easy, how do you know it's real? It's when it's hard, when it's difficult, and you choose anyway. That's when the faith is real. And that's what we see in the life of Abraham. This whole story ends with a reassurance of promises. God reassures the promises that he heard in Genesis 12, and he says these things will happen, and end of verse 18, because you have obeyed my voice. Abraham is justified through his actions here. And that's what we see in James chapter 2, that his faith was completed by his works, that they were fulfilled in this moment, that he was justified because he was willing to offer up his son. Life is a series of tests, to show if you're loyal to God or not. You are justified when you pass that test and you show your loyalty to Him. Pass the tests. Be like Abraham. Have more green than you do orange. I appreciate you guys.